The legacy of King Kong expands well beyond the movies. Of course, the original film would have never have been possible without the contribution of Willis O'Brien. Lately, King Kong superfan Gregory Coulon has been steadily putting together a comprehensive life story on Obi, featuring many stories that weren't heard until now, and also trying to dig down to the original roots of the stories, dispelling many famous urban myths along the way. I had a chance to speak to Gregory Coulon about his book. The interview went on for well over 2 hours. We covered quite a lot of topics, ranging from bits of trivia about King Kong to Willis O'Brien as a person. This video covers some of the major highlights about King Kong, but if you want a deep dive and listen to the whole interview, then be sure to check it out. The first of my questions cover the titular spider pit sequence.
So I suppose I'll get the big one out of the way first. This was a common question about the missing spider pit scene. So
Sure.
could you add some clarity? Because there's always been interest about the spider pit scene, but recently there's been a lot of interest about, was it filmed?
Yeah. There's so I have to go back and talk a little bit about the script to answer my view of that picture. If you look at the script development, as I said, they were working on the script while the test reel was being filmed. I mean, they started beforehand, they filmed the test reel, and then they kept updating the script into the early parts of production. So it's really interesting in that, especially on the animation scenes, when you start looking in the script versions that are dated after the test reel was either was well into production or finished, then most of the shots are marked as, we shot this one, or um, live action shot, animation to be done. You see little notes like that actually in the script. And so when you get to the end of the log sequence in the test reel, what you find is there's a detailed script breakdown, and almost all the shots for the what we know of today as the log sequence and the T-Rex shot, they're all called shot until you get to the spider pit, and they're blank. It doesn't say anything. They didn't film the spider pit for the test sequence. Everybody knows they didn't film that. So people look at those pages in the scripts and they think that it wasn't filmed because it wasn't shown as shot. However, the script files at RKO didn't get updated past, I think it was like September 6th or so, while the production was still going on. So those statuses in those scripts were not updated later. So so if anybody comes up to me and say they were not shot because of that script page showing it's not shot, well, I will ask them to show me a script page that shows the elevated train sequence and shows me the status of that being shot. Because unless you have a complete version of the script that has the entire film, we know they were working on the spider pit sequence after Shodzak went back to Arabia in, was it late October, early November of 1932. So it was one of the last things on the docket to be filmed. So those pages don't provide any evidence to me at all. What we do have is we have Willis O'Brien kept several photographs that were slop tests. And a slop test is basically a photograph done of the camera set up through the camera to check the lighting and do the matching and everything. So they absolutely had the scenes set up ready to shoot. They were lighting the shots and they were doing all that. We know that for a fact. The question is, you could argue, did they actually ever animate it? I believe they would have animated those shots. I don't think you go through several shots like that, and it's not just there are multiple angles too, right? So there's different shots in there. You would have finished one shot and then done another shot. So I can't believe they would have broken configuration or maybe have 2 or 3 different miniature stages working for the spider pit sequence at one time when they had so many other shots that were going on from Kong. So I personally believe they did animation for those shots. Now, to me, the real question is, did they ever actually integrate them into the film and during the editing process? And I think that's a valid question. Cooper said that he did. He said that, and his stories are not always consistent on this. He said that he did, and he said that it didn't work with the flow. And I mentioned him and Cheeseman were constantly optimizing the flow of the film, so we know he was working throughout the production, putting stuff in, seeing how it worked, and then throwing it out if it didn't work. So I have no doubt. I mean, I expect that he did that. I cannot find a solid piece of proof that ever said there was that shot. I do know that people said that O'Brien considered it some of his best animation. So there are several people that have said that they saw the animation, or that O'Brien loved the animation. Um, Marcel Delgado himself was inconsistent. There's some interviews where he said it was animated, and some interviews where he said it wasn't, or that he didn't see it. But also, if you look at a lot of Marcel's interviews, he also said he was so busy repairing the models, he never saw the dailies. So he didn't necessarily know what was being shot on any good day, or didn't necessarily see the footage. What we do know for a fact is that by January of 1933, January 15th, I believe, there's a Marion Cooper interview where he says that the scene is not going to be in the film. So this is the very first thing I've ever found relating to the spider pit. For years, people have been talking about it, but the first time I've ever seen anything published about the spider pit was published in, like I said, mid-January 1933, and he says it's out of the film. It was a horrific sequence, right? That they didn't feel they needed, and that is before the film was finished scoring. We also know that the score of the film um, was not changed. The score that Max Steiner wrote didn't include any additional shots in that sequence versus what we have today. So, and that mid-January date is before the first preview of the film in early February of 1933. So that sequence was never scored. It was never in the film before any preview audience ever saw it. I do not believe it was ever cut in. There's also, we know from Schoedsack that they had problems filming the actors falling into the stage, into the mud at the bottom of the pit, and they couldn't get that scene to work. As late as early January of 1933, they were still trying, working stuntmen falling into mud on wires, which is maybe another reason it didn't get cut. I mean, it got cut, right, because they were having a trouble there, filming some of those shots. But I believe the film was never completed in terms of, I don't think they ever had an entire integrated sequence. It was probably lacking a few animation cuts. It was probably lacking the shots of these sailors, live action sailors hitting the ground floor. Cooper himself said that, yeah, they stopped filming those because they filmed the long shots in miniature of the guys falling to the pit. Well, those guys are falling so far they look like they wouldn't survive, right? So they may have filmed those after Cooper already decided to shoot to throw out the shot. But I do not believe a paying audience ever, or a preview audience ever, saw an integrated spider pit sequence. Ray Bradbury told me multiple times he remembered seeing it, but Ray Bradbury remembers seeing his birth coming out of the birth canal. I actually was in an audience once while Ray Bradbury and Ray Harryhausen were on stage talking about this, and Ray Bradbury said he remembered seeing the sequence. And I looked at Ray Harryhausen at the time, and Ray Harryhausen is rolling his eyes and trying not to laugh when Ray Bradbury said he saw the sequence. So um, people will say they saw it. People will say you know, it was never filmed. You can have lots of things, but the continuity scripts for the film, which cover every second in the film, there's no continuity script that ever shows a spider pit sequence in there. There's no music score that ever shows there was additional footage in there for the spider pits, right? There's none of those things exist, but we do have the shots that show that they did the setup. They went as far, at least, as putting the animation models on the stage and lighting them. So I can't believe they didn't actually shoot some animation.
So, possibly absolute best, if it ever did existed, once, it would have been like incomplete. Would that be like a way to look at it?
I think the best you would ever say was maybe there was a print at RKO at the time that Cheeseman and Cooper were cutting that might have a few shots from the spider pit integrated in, pre-score, pre-sound effect, um, but those are gone. And it's also interesting to note, right? The creation test footage that exists, the shots that were going to be used in Kong don't exist in that creation test footage. So what happens, I think, was that they edited those films out. That original negative went to Ted Cheeseman to edit into the Kong sequence, and so that's why you don't find them in the creation prints that exist today. I think that footage likely ended up on the cutting room floor with Ted Cheeseman, and at some point, like they did probably with all of the footage for these things that they didn't use, once they had a final cut from the film, I imagine it probably went into a big burn barrel. I hate to say it, but I I would love to see this footage, but I do not believe we ever will. The one shot in the test reel that says shot regarding a spider is the description of a spider crawling up. um, Basically it's the description of what is now a lizard-like creature, right? That shot was done in the script. It's done and marked as shot as a spider. Now, you could sit there and say, well, that's proof positive that somebody animated a spider, and I would say no, it's proof positive that somebody animated that shot, but they may very well have just had that reptile in there instead of a spider when they shot it. A lot of these sequences, like you go through the script for Son of Kong, and it's a triceratops instead of a cave bear. So it was not uncommon for them to change the animal, right? In many people's minds, these were multiple dinosaurs. I need a meat eater dinosaur. I don't care if it's an iguanodon or a brontosaurus, right? A lot of these shots, they weren't too specific about what kind of dinosaur or monster they needed in it. So, a lizard creature versus a spider, I don't know that it would have made a big difference to the people when they were making the film. There is a story that the back legs of that that lizard that climbs up the vine are missing just because Delgado was still working on the model when O'Brien demanded that he hand it over because he needed to shoot the sequence that day. So O'Brien was never able to finish the back legs, so that's why they're not there.
I was going to
Um,
ask if that was meant to be like based on anything, like a made-up creature. No, it's just
no,
because
it
they
was
forgot.
Delgado said just wasn't finished with the model. So yeah, I think it's meant to be a much more normal looking kind of, at least traditional kind of lizard than it ended up looking like.
Something I was going to ask about, of course, Marion C. Cooper, in terms of his stories, that, from my understanding, was he the sort of fellow where he would tell a story, it would have some soft truth in it, like, let's say you've got a granddad who likes fishing now, he's caught loads of big fishes, but just to make his story seem a little bit more impressive, he might go, oh, the fish I caught, it was actually this big when it actually wasn't that big. Was he that kind of sort of showman, would you say?
Well, yeah, there's no doubt about it, right? He exaggerated his stories, but I will tell you one thing that I found out: his life was larger than life. There is no doubt about it. I mean, he was in multiple wars. He was prisoner of war twice, an escaped prisoner of war at one point. He filmed in the jungles. He did all kinds of stuff. He was an executive at airlines. Almost all of his stories, they get exaggerated, but it's not just. I was amazed when I go through the Cooper papers how much documentation there is that these stories are true. I mean, sure, I'm sure he made it sound a little bit bigger than it needed to be, but the gist of the story is still impressive to begin with when you see what he did. There was one time I had to, this is going forward again, to Mighty Joe Young, right? But I was having had a great conversation with Harryhausen once on, we were talking about Obi and Cooper, and so I had to ask him, right, because Cooper used to tell the story that that he acted out for Obi every scene that Kong or Mighty Joe Young would do. He acted in front of Obi, and then Obi would animate exactly the way Cooper told him. Um, that story's, goes around a lot. I think Cooper did actually tell versions of that story. Um, but so I asked Harryhausen about that. He goes, "Well, if Cooper ever acted out anything for Mighty Joe Young, Obi never told me about it. I just animated the shot the way I felt it should be animated." Um, so at least at least some of those were exaggerated. But so many stories he talked about. He talked about he got the approval for the test reel from Kong, and then suddenly Obi is in trouble and he gets a hand infection and can't animate, and Buzz Gibson is sick, and so I have to animate, right? That's the story. You go to the documentation though, and you can actually find that Obi did have problems with his hand. He had damaged it before the test reel, and the schedule was going down, and I think it was a really bad case of influenza that Buzz Gibson had. So there was a real concern that they had just got turned on for the Kong test reel, and none of the animators, the two big animators, were not available. Um, and Cooper's comments at the time was, "I don't know how I'm going to get this done. We're going to find a way to get somebody to animate." Right. And so there's a lot of there's a basis for that story that would be told over the years that you can actually find the 1930s documentation to a large extent back up pieces of the story. Um, but of course, I don't think Cooper ever planned on animating himself. That I think is the one piece that's just a stretch too far, right?
On the topic for unused concepts from King Kong, I had to ask Gregory about a story that I first heard about on the playground at school, which was, during the initial development for King Kong, instead of the stop motion creatures, were they going to film real animals such as a gorilla fighting a Komodo dragon?
Um, y- you know, it's hard to find vintage documents that says he would have actually filmed it that way. But there is no doubt you can find before he met O'Brien, he was talking to Selznick about a gorilla picture. Um, and he was talking to Selznick about a gorilla picture that takes this gorilla from some, prehistoric area, the top of a building in civilization. I've never found a document where Cooper, at least not written, at the time, written in the 1930s, where he said we're going to film it with Komodo, lizards. But I believe he would have done that, right? Cooper was an interesting filmmaker, and his he made a lot of jungle films. He staged in Siam the giant elephant stampede through the village. He was gutsy, right? He filmed the escape with the baboons. For the four feathers. I think he would have tried that out. I have no doubt he was interested in the concept because he wanted this gorilla picture, and his good friend Douglas Burden had just come back from Komodo Island with a few live Komodo dragons that unfortunately died within about 6 months. But Cooper saw them stuffed at the American Museum of Natural History. He had an interest of working with simians from his time in Africa, especially with the baboons on four feathers, and his interest in the stories he had been hearing about the gorillas in other parts of Africa. So I think if he could have pulled it off, he would have um, he would have done it that way.
I'm gonna guess either himself or the society at the time just didn't really think twice. Like, oh, maybe that gorilla wouldn't be too happy. Like, if the Komodo dragon came at it. Like, there was none of that. There was none of that going on in their heads, was there?
It was a different world back then, right? It was a different world. I mean, he did not. You got to remember when they're off filming Chang in the jungle, when they needed to, I mean, they set out bait and they got the tigers that they needed, and they, unfortunately, right, they killed tigers when they were out there, and they did things, I'm sure, to get the elephant stampede in Chang that would not be allowed, well, not even be allowed in 1950s Hollywood, let alone today's Hollywood, right? Um, but Cooper was, I think Cooper is Carl Denham to a large extent, right? He would have done what it takes to make a really interesting movie.
Why, in a few months it'll be up in lights on Broadway. Kong, the eighth wonder of the world!
When it finally got released, like, what was the impact of when it was released?
Well, yeah, you hear different stories. I think, I mean, it was to a certain segment of the audience phenomenal, right? People had seen something they never saw before, um, and it wasn't. I mean, the visuals were clearly astounding, but it also there weren't too many films that had a complete musical score. I mean, at least a fairly complete score. Although Max Steiner had done the scores for Most Dangerous Game and Bird of Paradise, they were similar, but to me, it was almost a perfect integration that impressed people of the music, the sound effects, and the visuals that were probably overwhelming to the people at the time. And the film did really excellent business. I mean, you can't put it another way. It drew huge crowds in New York. It drew huge crowds in LA, and across the world. Really, it got major audiences in London and Berlin and different places. The reviews were almost always enthusiastic. I mean, if they didn't like it, they might be nitpicking on the depth of the story or something, but almost nobody would ever say anything that it wasn't visually spectacular, that it was something brand new, that it wasn't something exciting or worth seeing. Um, I mean, it drummed up a lot of business and it pulled in some money from RKO. Now that said, um, I think it gets overestimated how much money Kong made on its initial thing, because as big a film as it was, it didn't make the top 10 list for 1933 by the end of the year. And most people don't realize that. Um, Cooper executive produced Little Women with Katharine Hepburn that came out in late 1933, and that did make the top 10 list of moneymakers for the year. It wasn't Star Wars, or it wasn't the movie that revolutionized. It wasn't something that everybody saw. It had a kind of a select audience it was grabbing. It made a lot of money, but it actually eventually, over the long term, because it got successfully re-released several times, made more money than any other film that was released in 1933. But that's because of all the successful re-releases. It just got bigger as it went along, and people loved it. And you always hear stories about people that said, "Oh, I saw it, and I was going to take my kid when I saw it was opening," right? Or it played for a while. If you look at the newspapers from 1933 and into 1934, you can find it still playing in theaters in 1934 while Kong is playing in theaters, right? So it was a different world back then, because the film didn't open in one weekend everywhere. It opened in different cities, spread out over several months, right? And then it went to second run theaters and different kinds of engagements. But all the reviews, almost all, were astounded by the visual effects.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video and you're new here, then be sure to subscribe, as you may like the other content I put out. Also, if you're intrigued with Gregory's book, then be sure to pick up a copy. I'm sure Gregory would appreciate it. That's all for now, until next time.